Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik 16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates. And no, I am not Delta, but I'm also not Omicron or Epsilon or Mu. I'm just 16. That's bars, not age, as you can see from the beard. If you have not picked up on the theme, we are clearly going into scientific territory, traveling at the speed of thought, back into the undisputed golden era of hip-hop, the late 1980s, to discuss and review none other than the classic from the Bronx's own UltraMagnetic MC's Critical Beatdown. Now, this is an album that is widely acclaimed by the hip-hop sphere as a crucial branch in the foundational hip-hop tree that spawned a lot of things that were picked up on and that continue today. Now, it is up to us to determine how classic is this classic, and we're going to do that using the scale, the rap ruler. If you have not, please take a visit to therapruler.com, learn about the I Used to Love Her scale or the rap ruler, see how things work, or you can like and subscribe to this channel and go back, look at some of the introductory videos from the very beginning where I explain how our rating system and scale works. Be a part of it, join in, and make some requests. As you can see, the last episode we did a special request. I'm going to give you both episodes in the same week because I assume that I am going to speed through this. That means we're going into category 1 in this video, which is our review of the album, the product itself. Now, just a little background on this album. It was released in October of 1988, and this album serves more like a collection of songs released by UltraMagnetic through the mid-80s all the way to the late 80s. And this is an album that was retroactively given 5 mics by the Source magazine when they did their big 100th issue and went and gave flowers to albums that they didn't get to give 5 mic ratings in real time to. So, you know. Now, the first dimension that we talk about when we go into category 1 is going to be quality of production. If nothing else can be said about this album, and if nothing else has been said about this album, it is talk of the production, not just the sound, but the techniques that were used here. And this album is almost solely produced by group member and the main MC, Said G, who takes a back seat on just one track for the legendary Paul C. So these are 2 big hip hop names in history. They were responsible for lots of productions and studio work on other classics, as well as this album. So, Said G has talked extensively about his chopping technique. The reason this album gets talked about so much is because some of the sampling chopping that was done here was unprecedented for the times that a lot of the singles were released. By the time this album came out, the practices and techniques that Said G was showcasing were kind of standard fare and kind of outdone and bested by people who had come after, like Public Enemy. And so, ironically, you're going to hear some of the same samples that were prevalent on lots of albums that came out in this same year. And so things like the grunt sample by the JBs with the whistling high-pitched horn blow that got modulated and used to death all over Public Enemy's album. And you'll hear this in the review that's coming up of It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, where we talk about the techniques used by the Bomb Squad and that, particularly that whistle. So by the time you hear a song like Ease Back, it's like, I've heard this. You're hearing lots of JB's beat breaks, guitar breakdowns, drum breakdowns, and that's mostly what this album is. It's drum heavy production where the melody is an afterthought. Melodies come and go. Melodies are usually saved for the hook breakdowns. It's like, oh, okay, here's where the sample. For instance, the song Funky, everyone in reviews mentions how this uses the Joe Cocker sample from his song Woman to Woman that EPMD really made big with Knick Knack Paddywhack, and Dr. Dre made bigger with the California Love remix. or the California Love song, depending on which version you consider the remix. And so it's used sparingly here. It's used in between, I think maybe 8-bar counts, but mostly, here and there to introduce the ending or major breaks in the verses. So it's not a melody that persists throughout, because the emphasis here is just on boom bap drum patterns. And so you're gonna get that on 1 minute less. You're gonna get that on the Paul C production, which is noted as one of the more popular songs from this album. It's really just a low drum hit. It's a bass drum the whole time, and it sounds like the same melody as the disco song Treat You Right, Treat Me Right, which Chuck Rock turned into Treat 'Em Right. And so it sounds like that same melody with just a bass drum hit. So boom, 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 boom. So a lot of up-tempo pacing on this whole album, because most of the beats are frenetic. They are raw nerve type of beats that start off with sped up versions of the original samples and then break down into just kind of these open drum, bass, boom bap tracks for the most part. And I think that's what this album also gets a lot of attention for, the splicing of different songs. And so if we're talking about singles that were released in 1986 and 1987, these things were still very new to hip hop. So, UltraMagnetic gets credited as being like out of the box thinkers or ahead of their time, because they were doing this, which is a style that De La Soul went and really refined and fine-tuned on their debut with the help of Prince Paul. And where this was the raw version of it because it was so new. It's almost similar to RZA when he first was introducing his production style on Into the 36 Chambers. By the time you got to an album like Only Built for Cuban Links, you got a more polished RZA. RZA had found the notch where he wanted all his sounds to go, and just the mood he wanted to induce, where a lot of the first album beats were murky and dusty. That's what this is. It's the rawness of it. Like I mentioned, by 1988, there were so many albums that had already used these samples. If you weren't familiar with the history of UltraMagnetic through their releases of singles from 1986 on, then it would just sound like nothing new. Ego Tripping uses the synthetic substitution sample from Melvin Bliss. They're credited as being the first to use that beat break and that ding. And so that's a huge milestone in hip hop, because that is one of the most overused breaks besides Impeach the President, which I know I mentioned every other episode, but that's how standard that is, as well as a lot of the James Brown breaks that we're using here, like funky drumming. And so if you're into lively, up-tempo, grassroots, boom bap hip hop on the SP12, because again, Said G is never shy about talking about the equipment and techniques that he used to do this, chopping without looping, loading sounds into his SP12, and he makes it clear it's not the SP1200, it's the original SP, which was a big deal at the time, and putting them together. And so there's genius in that, because if you think about the way songs are produced in modern times and what had to be done to put sounds from different songs together, then UltraMagnetic was way ahead of their time. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2, the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. So if we're keeping in mind that this album is a collection of songs recorded and released between 1986 and 1988, you gotta imagine that some of the sounds are catching up to what's going on in hip hop at the time. So as much as UltraMagnetic may have been ahead of their time with production, they are also, trying to create an album and not just use all the singles. Said G is quoted as saying that had they just used all of their collective singles to make the album, then it would have already been done, but they went and added new songs, and I think you can hear the differences. So when you hear a song like Ego Tripping and a song like Funky, you can hear the difference in not only the production style, but the way that Said G and Kool Keith were rapping. And then by the time you get to the final song, Delta, or Said G is Delta, you hear a more music-based kind of production. It sounds more like a song than any other track on there because there's more melodic elements and it's more toned down, and every other song is just kind of empty and raw and almost missing key parts. It's just boom bap. And then, like I said, little sample melodies sprinkled here and there. So that's gonna affect how tight-knit the album sounds. You're hearing things all out of chronological order. The first two songs sound more 1988. Ego Trippin' being the third song, it just kind of like, it's like, whoa, everything sounds different here. The energy is different. And then you're getting the song like Traveling at the Speed of Thought, which samples Louie Louie, the classic, rock song from the 50s or 60s. And, this is something that we heard on the other Said G produced album, Criminal Minded, where KRS-One raps over Back in Black by AC/DC for Dope Beat. So it's not unheard of because Run DMC ran with this style. This is, King of Rock. This is Walk This Way. Heavy rock guitars were sampling from a super popular rock and roll song. But where does that fit after a song that heavily samples James Brown, or a song that samples Joe Cocker next? So this album kind of jumps all over the place. The only thing that weaves it together is that it is a mostly up-tempo album. So the pacing of the songs keep the vibe going. Again, into that final song where it mellows out a little. So yeah, that affects the cohesiveness, and that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And we move into dimension 3. The question of, is there an intentional mood or tone on this album? If there had to be a tone or mood narrowed down, it would seem more like the upset, the underdog upsetters. It's almost like UltraMagnetic for all their connections in the industry, because if we're talking about hip-hop being a tree in the 80s, UltraMagnetic is definitely centralized. They are connected to so many other rap acts just from, Said G alone in his presence, that it can't be denied. But I think they may not have had the foresight to know that they were going to be that important in history. And so they're coming out with a, F you attitude. And there's subliminals on here, and, there's a lot of braggadocious battle rap. This is a battle rap album for its time. So without having a specific beef, they go at the status quo. So if there's any mood or tone, it's we want to battle on every song. There's no break from that. Every rapper can get it. And that's mostly a sentiment that is shared. Said G and Kool Keith approach that the very same way, with some of the same language, just with different inflections. And that's pretty much all it is. Every single song is battle ready. There's no breaks to go party. There's no breaks to, go dance or, talk about life. And so if you pick up on any other themes or tones or moods from this album, it's a fast-paced, up-tempo album, and the rap style matches that. Please point it out. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4, the question of repetition of sounds versus song distinction, or song distinction versus repetition of words and sounds. I mentioned already that because there's such an emphasis on boom bap, and because we're using very, very rudimentary production equipment, which was advanced and nouveau for its time, we're still dealing with simplistic stuff. So there's gonna be a lot of repetition of sounds because the sounds were limited. SP12 limits what you can do in one. And for its time, Said G combining these different samples and chopping them the way he did, that was pretty dynamic. But it still doesn't stop an album of this particular length, because there's no less than 15 tracks from getting to a point of redundancy. The boom bap after a while wears down. The high pace after a while can wear a listener down. And again, lack of melody throughout an album just takes away from fullness. So while you're getting rawness, there's a lot of emptiness being delivered throughout the soundscape of this album. And then words are the most redundant occurrence on air for all of the pseudo-scientific language that's used. Kool Keith and Said G are credited as being precursors to a lot of rappers, but if anything, their nearest descendant, I would say, would be like a Keith Murray, someone who made a style out of just using big words to use them, but not really saying much. So it's pseudo-scientific language, they'll say words that other rappers weren't saying at the time, but they don't always connect to make these full thoughts, full phrases of thought. It's, approximate, and, we're using words like hydrochloric acid or supplicate, but those words are just kind of thrown in there. And so words that get repeated is how they term rappers. So you're gonna hear rappers called toys, ducks, suckers, germs, roaches. All variations of those words, and that is kind of their calling card and their legacy, calling rappers germs and roaches. And I'm sure that can be attributed mostly to Kool Keith, but that is going to be used throughout. Also, brains. There's a lot of brains talk. I don't think Kool Keith has a verse where he's not using the word brains, referencing what happened to the brains of whack MCs, or in boiling. There's a lot of cooking and heating up of rappers. A lot of the same words get thrown around on here, but a lot of brain talk, and Kool Keith has admitted it himself. Pseudo-scientific language, derogatory metaphors of rappers being critters or things to eradicate, and lots of boom bap, high-paced stuff. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 5. The amount of content versus the amount of songs. As I mentioned, this album has no less than 15 songs, and every track is about the same thing. Paul C's production does give you more of a dance-ready track, but instead of seizing that opportunity to kind of take a break from battling, it's almost kind of like sneakily too, because Kool Keith starts that song sounding like he's gonna party. He has the classic line about being like a pimp, but that's about it. It goes right into, challenging all contenders. And that is every song on this album. That's it. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 6. Features. Again, golden era. Features are not a thing unless you count the scratches by their own DJs, Mo Love and TR. It's crew. It's crew within crew. They shout out the Jungle Brothers. They shout out Public Enemy, ironically. And those are really the only outside rap acts that get shouted out. Red Alert and the Violators, that's still all the Jungle Brothers crew at the time, before Native Tongues were solidified and established as a thing. So that's who gets the props there. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Do you think features were important? Should they have had some features to break things up? Dimension 7. Do or does the weakest song or songs on this album take away from it? It's super, super duper up to you and subjective on what is a weak song on this album. It has its moments if you don't like the rock sample of Louie Louie on Traveling at the Speed of Thought. then you're not gonna like that use, and that might be a weak song to you. If you don't like the offbeat staccato of Ego Trippin' using that synthetic substitution sample and you can't catch the beat, that might be the weakest track. If Break North or When I Burn, or the songs that kind of lead the album out, they wear you down, then those might be the weak songs to you. Or if you don't like the songs without Kool Keith, or you don't like the songs without Said G, those could be deciding factors, because both rappers have solos. Kool Keith's solos are placed right next to each other. Kool Keith has 3 actually. And one is Kool Keith housing things, the other is Mo Love. The song about Mo Love, Kool Keith is the only one who raps on it. And Said G has 1 Minute Less and the Delta song, but they're spaced in different ways, where it probably would have been better for the Said G solo to come after the Kool Keith solo to kind of break it up. But if you don't like them alone, you might consider that to be weak, and that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Okay. Even though this is a critically acclaimed album, that seems to be where it begins and ends. In all of the reviews of this album, it is noted how this is a sorely overlooked, underrated album that people had to go back and give flowers to because of all the things that it sparked or planted the seeds for, like the sampling techniques, pseudo-scientific language in hip-hop, and even some of the offbeat rhyme patterns that people credit Said G and Kool Keith for developing or introducing to the rap game. And so that SP12 production is really monumental to the game, and I think coming from a rap nerd perspective is where you start hearing the buzz about this album. I think the other way you hear about it is from people who lived through it and experienced some of these songs when they were singles before they became an album. And so this album didn't move a lot of units. It was released on the Next Plateau label, which was the home of Salt and Pepper for a long time. And these two groups made that a viable label for hip hop, because before it was a disco label. But you're not, gonna have a lot of mainstream recollection of this album. And for one, I don't remember this group as a young person in the 80s growing up. I just don't remember this group being talked about. That's how much not on the mainstream radar they were. And I think you really had to be an adult living through the times to know of them, because I can't even picture an UltraMagnetic MC's video in my head from watching Video Music Box back in the days, or Yo MTV Raps. So really, for the crate diggers, for the hip hop heads, for this album to be underground at a time where an underground scene wasn't really established, means that these guys unfortunately got lost in the sauce somewhere. And ironically, for as many groups that they inspired, they got eclipsed by not having a debut album in the times where their singles were percolating. So if Ego Trippin' and Funky were some of their defining singles, the fact that they didn't have a whole full-length LP to follow and house those songs meant that these were just songs that got mixed in on DJ mix shows or DJ tapes or DJ, in clubs or parties, but didn't have a home. And so by the time we get to a more, well-developed album like the Public Enemy albums that really, Bomb Squad producers like Hank Shockley credit UltraMagnetic for pioneering or putting down a first layer for them to build upon and perfect, the student becomes the teacher, so to speak. Because for the year 1988 to give you albums like Long Live the Kane and The Great Adventures of Slick Rick and Straight Outta Compton, it's just like, for this to be the final version of the album coming with these kind of outdated, primitive sounding tracks, it's like there's no way you can tell me these were from the same era or that this is supposed to compete with that. So unfortunately, I think this album never had a real chance to go, because they had already, the songs that were going to pop from here had already seen their time. Also, you know, rap flowing had evolved by 1988. There was way more fluidity as opposed to the staccato and offbeat rhyme styles that Ced Gee and Kool Keith were bringing. It was more like basic when you got someone like Big Daddy Kane, who was using multiple syllables in a stacking rapid fire flow, or Slick Rick, who was just being super playful, bending words and kind of talking to himself in this cadence, going back and forth in conversational style. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the rap performance on the album, but all of these things are something to consider when we're talking about mass appeal on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence, right? So impact, we keep talking about how, you know, everyone has gone back, the music critics and hip-hop fans and hip-hop heads have credited this album with so much, but the impact seemed to be kind of minimal as an album by the time it was released. So not only was this released in the same year as some of the albums I named, we also have this coming out later in the year. In October, all of these albums have already dropped. So if I'm getting Public Enemy and I'm new to UltraMagnetic MCs, or maybe I only heard 1 or 2 songs, yeah, I'm gonna think that they are sounding like Public Enemy, because this is the bigger album of the year and this is the more talked about album of the year. So I think the impact was low for its time. The impact now people are seeing because they're looking back at when UltraMagnetic really set foot into the game and what they brought forward. Which takes us to influence. The influence is there. Like I mentioned, a lot of hip hop producers say that, you know, UltraMagnetic laid the groundwork for them to go on. You know, they crawled so they can run and fly. That's pretty much what it is. I'm sure Prince Paul credits them. I'm sure, you know, Dre credits them in some way, but, you know, the influence is more in the production. Every now and then you get a rapper that mentions Kool Keith's influence, and I think what Kool Keith did was made it okay to be a cool weirdo. And I think for 1988, I don't know if weirdo would be like as quickly branded or quickly attributed to him as it would now with all of his personas and what he's come to be to hip hop. But for his time, weird just in the sense that he's using obscure terms to rap, where, you know, this is more of the changing of the guard into the slick talk rapping, right? Going from super outlandish superhero style bragging to super slick materialistic bragging and punchline rapping. And these guys coming in just using, you know, some real, you know, like Kool Keith says something like, your head is shaped like a mango, I'm gonna eat it, you know, things like that. But if that opened the lane for some rappers not to be afraid to rap like that, then there's some influence. And every now and then you will hear rappers credit Kool Keith for making that. Okay, cool. Innovation. We just talked about all of the innovation coming from Ced Gee's production style. Even Paul C, mostly Ced Gee chopping samples at times where it wasn't such a dominant sound. And so introducing that to the game allowed so much to happen. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. And this is where, you know, the nostalgia conversation is always going to come up. If you lived during the time where you remember the UltraMagnetic MC singles coming out, then it might hold a different resonance to you by the time you heard it as an album, because you remember them having a presence in hip hop. Like I said, by 1988, the casual hip hop listener or the young person may not have all of that connective tissue to UltraMagnetic MCs and knew of the bigger acts that were out And also, if you're waiting this long to make a full-length release as an album, and most albums sound more advanced by then, this album not only sounds dated, but it sounds dated by the standards of its own year. And so, you know, the nerdy hip-hop appreciation for what this album introduced is cool and all, but I really wonder if, as a listener right now, if you could really sit through all 17 of these tracks and say it feels timeless. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that concludes our Category 1 review of the classic album, Critical Beatdown by the UltraMagnetic MCs. And join us for video 2 where we go over the rap performance. I can't wait to get into that. And until then, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live in words and laugh.